Okay, so today we're going to learn how to graph secant and cosecant. And those are the reciprocals of sine and cosine. So first one that we're going to graph is cosecant. Now, before we go to graph this, realize that what we're going to graph first is the sine graph. And if you think about your coordinate plane here, this is 0 and 2 pi. This is pi over 2. This is pi. This is 3 pi over 2. And we're going to use these axis points. So the 1 comma 0, 0 comma 1, negative 1 comma 0, 0 negative 1. So if you recall that when you want to do sine of, say, 0 degrees, remember sine looks at y, so sine of 0 degrees is 0. When you do sine of pi over 2 is going to look at the y of this order pair, and it's 1. This is how you get your sine graph, by using these points. Because if you think about it, when we go to make our graph now, remember the breakdown for sine went by 90s. So this was pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. Remember the sine graph does a complete cycle in 2 pi. Over here is going to be exactly the same radian measures, but with negatives. So negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, and negative 2 pi. Goes up to 1 and to negative 1. So again, remember when sine of 0 degrees, and remember sine always starts at 0, 0. Then sine of pi over 2, it goes up to the 1. Then at sine of pi, that goes back to 0. And then 3 pi over 2 is here and here. Just follow the wave. You know, you don't have to draw the axis points like that. If you know that the sine graph starts at 0, 0, and then from there, if there's not an amplitude, it goes up to 1, then back down, down, up. You don't need to memorize that. Now, recall that the normal values for sine, remember, they were fractions. So sine is always going to be in between negative 1 and 1. And notice where my graph is. My graph goes, the highest it gets is 1, and the lowest it gets is negative 1. So it's oscillating in between negative 1 and positive 1. Remember the cosecant graph, that's going to be, it has to be greater than 1, and it also has to be less than negative 1. So my cosecant graph, when I create it, it's going to be up here and down here. I'm going to show you how we're going to make that. Get rid of that. Get rid of the blue lines. All right, so now, if you recall that sine was y over r, cosecant is r over y. It's the reciprocal. So if you get, for example, sine of 0, this was 0 over 1, which simplified to 0. But now when I do cosecant of 0 degrees, I flip it to the reciprocal, and now this is undefined. So every place that my sine graph touches the x-axis where it equals 0, those are going to turn into asymptotes. They're going to be vertical asymptotes. So I'm going to draw in every place that my graph touches the x-axis, I'm going to draw a vertical asymptote. These vertical asymptotes are going to be my boundaries or my walls where my cosecant graph is going to stay in between. Remember asymptotes, your graph doesn't cross them. Okay, so every place that my sine graph touched the x-axis where it equaled 0, for the cosecant graph, it's undefined. And this is why I'm putting in the asymptotes. So now to create your cosecant graph, you're going to take, and all these points that are the highest point and the lowest point, we're going to use the asymptotes as guides, and we're going to fill them in with these U's and these upside down U's. So over here, same thing. And then at these two low points. So my cosecant graph is the red. You could erase the sine graph if you wish, but all we need left is the red. When you're doing this on your test, if you don't want to erase the original sine graph, you can just lightly scribble over the one that you don't want anymore, or you could try to erase it. I could bring out colored pencils if you want to just put a different color on the one that needs to go away. Either way. All right, let's try. Now, the secant graph, but before we can graph the secant graph, we need to graph the cosine graph first. So again, this time when we go to do this, so for example, cosine of 0 degrees, remember cosine looks at x, so cosine of 0 degrees or 0 radians is 1. And if you recall, cosine always starts at 1, and then from there goes down. If you did cosine pi over 2, this one's going to be 0, negative 1. So at cosine pi over 2, the answer is 0. So let's go ahead and create our cosine graph. You really don't need to use those axis points. You should already know that we're going to break this into the 90s. Pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, and negative 2 pi. So cosine always starts at the 1. And then from there, it's going to go down to 0 at pi over 2. It's going to go down to negative 1 at pi. It's going to go back up to 0 at 3 pi over 2. And then back up to 1 at 2 pi. It's going to come down. So next we'll come down here, here, and here. So down, up, up. We'll draw in our asymptotes. So we have one here at negative 3 pi over 2. We have another one at negative pi over 2. Another one at pi over 2. And the last one at 3 pi over 2. Notice there's no asymptote on the y-axis. Now, remember our cycle, so if you want to put a frame around this, this is where our graph should be enclosed by. So from here, from negative 2 pi to 0 is one cycle, and then from 0 to 2 pi is the other. Now the reason why I did this is when I go to make my U's, notice over here, if I were to make the whole U here, see how this yellow one is out of the box? So I don't need to show that half of the U up there. Down here I'll put it. This point gets it. Down here. And again, over here, I don't need to show this part of it because it's outside of my cycle. So the only thing that is my secant graph is the blue. So you can either choose to erase all the red, and just leave the blue. You need to show me the asymptotes and where they're going. It'll help guide your U's and your upside down U's. Yes.
Will you get points off if you don't?
So this one, notice it's got an amplitude. And it also has a speed change. Remember, when it's a fraction, this is going to be slower. It's going to take me longer to complete the cycle. Remember, you're going to take 2 pi and you divide it by this number. So 2 pi divided by 1/2, keep flip change, it becomes 4 pi. So it's going to now, instead of completing the cycle in just 2 pi, I'm going to complete it in 4 pi. So now I'm going to take 4 pi, multiply it by 1/4, and then 1/2, 3/4. So this gives me pi. This gives me 2 pi. This gives me 3 pi. Remember, for this was just the mirrored image. I don't need to calculate the negative side. It's just going to be the same numbers I just got, but with negative signs. So let's go ahead, and this first one is going to be pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. Negative pi, negative 2 pi, negative 3 pi, negative 4 pi. This had an amplitude of 2. So I'll add that in also. So because it's asking me to graph secant, I'm going to graph cosine first. Cosine normally starts at 1, but because there's an amplitude, I'm going to start at the amplitude, which is 2. Then from there, I'm going to go down to pi, down again at the 2 pi, back up to 0 at 3 pi, and back up to the 2 at 4 pi. So this like this. And then over here, down, down, up, up. I now need to draw in my asymptotes. So every place that my graph touches the x-axis, I'm going to draw a vertical asymptote. And now all the points that I don't have that vertical asymptote through, that's where I make my U's. So if it helps you to frame, so you can know where not to put the other half of the U. So over here, up and away. Here, let's do it with this. Down here, down and away, up and away, down, down, and then this goes back in. So don't show this part that's outside of the box, the other half of the U. And if you want to cross off everything that you shouldn't include in your answer, you just put scribbles over it. Okay, last example. Again, we need to graph the reciprocal. So we're going to graph the negative sine x minus pi. Again, when there's something added or subtracted to x, this is a shift left and right. So this tells me it's minus, it's backwards of what I think. So I'm going to go right and right pi degrees, which is 180 degrees. So this is similar to that homework one, where our 4 points that are to the left of pi may not be 4 points that are on the negative side. So let's go ahead and figure out what we need to get on here. So pi over 2, pi. Everybody realize that I can just pull these 90-degree apart angles from my axis. So 90, then pi is 180, 270 is 3 pi over 2, full circle 2 pi. I'm starting here at pi, so I need to go 2 more. Now this is where we don't have the values, so you could take your 2 pi, add pi over 2, but I need a common denominator. So 4 pi over 2, So this becomes 5 pi over 2. Do it one more time. 6 pi over 2. So this is 3 pi, and this is 5 pi over 2. Going back this way. This time I'm going to have a stopping point on 0. Because watch, if I do pi over 2 minus pi over 2, I get 0. So I will have a stopping point on 0. And then I get negative pi over 2. And I need one more point beyond that, so it's negative pi. Now this did not have an amplitude, but it's a negative sign. So let me put my -1 here. Sine normally starts at 0, 0, but I'm shifting it over to pi, so I'm going to start here. But the negative sign in front of the word sine tells me to go down first. So I'm going down at the 3 pi over 2. Then at 2 pi back up, there and there. Over here I can complete the pattern, put it here, 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 and here. So I'm going to go ahead and connect my points. I'm going to draw in my vertical asymptotes at every point that's touching the x-axis. So I have a vertical asymptote at negative pi. I have a vertical asymptote at 0, at pi, 2 pi, and at 3 pi. So now I'm going to go ahead and draw in my cosecant graph. So here would be the graph. I'm going to connect all of these and make my U shapes. Again, I can get rid of the red, and my cosecant graph that has been shifted 180 degrees, my negative cosecant graph, is what remains in blue. Your homework is going to be the problems that are listed on Canvas 7, 9, 11, and 13.